There is this kind of view that young people are all terribly woke, they're all ideologically left-wing, they all care deeply about social justice issues, they've got, strident views on race or on transgender issues. That's not really true.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Sam Bidwell from the Adam Smith Institute talks about young people and politics.
I think there's this narrative you see sometimes in the pages of the Telegraph or wherever, young people are lazy. I think it's true at all. I think what young people have is an economic environment in which they work very hard. They work just as hard as their parents did, but for fewer rewards.
Sam says the breakdown of our social contract radicalises Britain's youth.
More and more young people are attracted to radical ideological positions of the left and of the right. What those two ideas have in common is basically, I don't like what we've got now, let's have something totally different. And the result of that is a political culture in which it's very, very difficult to kind of build consensus, build coalition.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Sam Bidwell, journalist and director at the Next Generation Centre at the Adam Smith Institute. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
So, there's a commonly held view that young people are woke and radically left. You work a lot with young people at the Next Generation Centre. How accurate is that for you?
So it's a slightly more complex picture, as you might imagine. Young people do vote for parties of the left. At the last election, there were about 18% of people under the age of 35 voted for either Reform or the Tories, the parties that you might say are of the right. The rest voted for parties of the left. So it's fair to say that young people lean left. That's correct. I think the misconception is about how left-wing they are and why they're left-wing. So there is this kind of view that young people are all terribly woke, they're all ideologically left-wing, they all care deeply about social justice issues, they've got strident views on race or on transgender issues. That's not really true. I think what most people under the age of about 35, 40 are is passively centre-left. They kind of go along with the cultural milieu, which is one in which the job of the government is to eliminate risk or harm. So that means more regulation, that means a bigger state, etc. Right? So we've kind of transformed from this view where the job of government is to facilitate growth, facilitate people's individual flourishing, to a system where the job of government is to eliminate risk and harm. I think most young people go, well, that's a nice idea, right? It'd be nice if fewer people had bad outcomes, etc. And that, I think, is the big shift. It's not that young people have all become radical. There's always been a core of young radical people, generally of the left, because the left has tended to be anti-tradition, anti-establishment, etc. And it's easier as a young person to come along and say, I don't like all these established ideas, I want to do something completely new. Hobbes writes in the 16th century, 17th century, he says the universities have been to England what the Trojan horse was to the Trojans, right? The wooden horse was to the Trojans. So this idea of the universities as a kind of hub of subversive left-wing thought goes all the way back to Hobbes. What's happened is that the cultural mainstream in the country has shifted towards one in which fewer people are earning their money through private enterprise, they're earning it more through the state or through regulators or through jobs like HR and compliance, which are not wealth creating, they're downstream of regulatory burden, and therefore people think in these risk elimination terms. And so what you get is a generation of people who have not really been served by the Conservative Party, I think it's fair to say, who've not really been served by what they perceive to be market economics, though I and most of my colleagues at the ASI would dispute whether or not the UK is really accurately described as a market economy, certainly not in the way that we might like, and in which more and more young people kind of exist in a space in which the lens through which they view politics is eliminate risk, eliminate harm, government's got to do something, there ought to be a law, etc. Of course, therefore, you end up with people who are kind of passively centre-left. But I don't think we've got a generation of ideologues. I think there's been a failure either to deliver materially for these people from parties of the right. The Conservative Party's had 14 years. What's it done for people on housing? What's it done for people on their ability to start a family? We've had 16 years now of stagnant economy, stagnant wages, etc. It's no wonder that people have got nothing to conserve. Of course, they're not conservative. And also, on the other hand, Conservatives have failed to point out that market capitalism, neoliberalism, etc. It's not really the dominant ideology in the UK anymore, certainly not since 1997, when we've become much more regulatory, managed, bureaucratic country. So I think there's been a failure both to deliver and to articulate the idea that conservatism is actually an alternative to what we've got right now.
How much do you think a disillusionment with the political establishment has affected young people's views on Britain and democracy?
Well, look, I mean, people feel an attachment to institutions when they feel that those institutions have delivered materially for them, right? We're all transactional creatures. We all like systems that we feel work for us. It's why, you know, in some parts of the world, I was in Singapore last year. Singaporeans have a kind of fairly managed democracy, but they're very happy with it because it delivers a level of prosperity for them. It delivers a house reliably, it delivers a job reliably, it delivers an education reliably. What has happened is that our traditional systems, or those systems which are perceived to be traditional, so parliamentary democracy, capitalism, which is always a kind of slightly murky, ill-defined phrase, you know, property ownership as a concept, all of these ideas have failed to deliver for people as far as they're concerned. And my argument, and the argument of the Next Generation Centre, would be that the failure hasn't been in those ideas, it's been in the failure to actually realise those ideas. But of course what happens is people look at it and they say, well, we've got a parliamentary democracy now, we've got a system where you go to vote and actually nothing changes. And of course what I and my colleagues would argue is, well, you know, hang on a minute, ministers have got less power than ever. There are more and more regulatory checks, more and more second order restrictions on what political actors can do, so things like judicial review, which has expanded enormously in the last couple of decades. So I would say, well, look, no, the problem is not parliamentary democracy, it's a lack of actually going through and doing it. And you blow that up across the system, and you've got a bunch of different institutions that don't really work for people, and which people then become sceptical of. Of course, what you then get is the scepticism of the nation state as a whole. You know, this isn't working, our system isn't working, I'm not somebody who feels any great allegiance to Britain as an identity marker because, you know, not only am I getting nothing back from it, but we've got this broken social contract where I pay in a lot to get not much out. So of course I don't feel any great allegiance to the nation state, and what's more, revisionist historians, revisionist academics, revisionist politicians have been allowed to run rampant across the history space, right? The mainstream way in which we discuss history has shifted enormously away from kind of pro-nation state thinking. I'm not sure that's where most of the public sits for the time being, but it's certainly where a loud minority of kind of middle-class academics and thinkers sit. And so if all you're hearing is negativity and all you're experiencing is negativity, of course you end up disillusioned and you feel, well, you know, what's in it for me? Maybe I'll move abroad.
Ofcom said that young people get most of their news through social media on their phones. I mean, what role do you think social media is playing in those things you were discussing?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think there's a tendency amongst conservatives to be sceptical of social media and to say, you know, this is fewer checks on information, ergo it's more likely that there's going to be disinformation, ergo, you know, we should be worried about it and we should try and regulate it. I think that the great arc of history is that you can never regulate away people's access to information, right? Gutenberg comes out with the printing press. You've got large parts of Europe which say we must ban this terrible thing. It allows the printing of subversive material, good and bad. You know, they're talking about online, or the equivalent of online pornography, sort of the printing of smutty bits of literature. They're talking about dissident texts like those of Martin Luther. We must ban this thing. And of course we know how terribly that goes, right? It never works. People find ways around it. What we've tended to do as a species is move towards fewer and fewer institutional checks on information. And that has good, you know, that's good and bad, right? It leaves people who are discerning in a much stronger position. So I can now access ideas, texts, people that I would not have accessed 30 years ago if I just watched the BBC. But at the same time, it does mean that people are susceptible to misinformation, disinformation, etc. I think that's a kind of, again, I go back to the printing press, it's this awkward process of adjustment. So we're now moving into an age where, you know, a majority of people younger than me probably were raised on the internet, as it were. They spent a lot of their time on the internet. They're familiar with social media as a form of getting their news. I think what will probably happen is over time people adjust and they learn to be more discerning, and you know that will become really important as for example AI rises as a normal tool that people can access. You know, we're going to all have to get a lot better at spotting what's a real image and what's not.
It's very difficult already.
It's really difficult already, and these tools are getting very, very good. But I'm not worried per se about social media. I think you can never. It's one of those kind of historical forces that it's fruitless to push back against, right? The Soviets tried all they could. China is a really good example. You know, people talk about the Great Firewall. Young Chinese people have all got VPNs. That's one of the most effective, you know, intrusive states in the world, and yet it still can't restrict people's access to outside information. It's really hard to push back on that. So I think we need to embrace it, lean into it. As people on the right get good at it, is a kind of crucial idea. But I mean, the other thing that it's done is it's globalized information, and again, for good and bad. A lot of the racial politics that we now discuss in this country is essentially American in character. They had segregation of races within people's living memory. You know, if you were born in 1945, you're an older person now, but you can remember being an adult when there was very real segregation. We never did. You know, we've had difficulties historically with conflicts between groups, but often those have been, for example, kind of Catholic versus Protestant. They've been Irish versus English. You know, the dynamics of race and ethnicity in this country are just totally different to those in America. And we've also imported this idea of, you know, kind of American propositional nationalism. So, you know, America is a nation of immigrants. So goes the kind of the myth around it, and that's hard to refute fully. You know, the English who went over, and then the successive generations of Germans and Irish and Italians, etc. Again, not really true in England, or really in the British Isles as a whole. We've actually had a remarkably static population until around 1950, when it starts to drip, and then it really kind of ticks up in 1997. We've got a lot of outward migration. And so what you end up doing with the kind of the online space, the expansion of the online space as a forum or a hub for people's news consumption, is you end up importing narratives from the world's biggest English-speaking country. You know, I think we'd be in a different position if the Americans spoke French. We probably wouldn't be getting quite as much through. The French certainly aren't getting as much through as we are. But there is this, you know, there is a need intellectually to counter some of those stories about drug policy, about race, about, you know, concentration of wealth. All of these things are different in America to the UK. It's important we don't import the narratives. But again, I think we do that through information, arguments, making the case, rather than through kind of regulation or scepticism.
So you mentioned young people moving abroad. As a YouGov survey of 18 to 24-year-olds, almost a third of them want to move abroad. Why is this figure so high?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that a lot of people say they want to move abroad. The figures on British national emigrants haven't really gone up very much. In fact, they've come down since the 1990s. I think we're probably 5 or 10 years away from, if things don't change, from that number coming back up again. But the reason is basically one of social contract. So, you know, once again, you work very, very hard. I think there's this narrative you see sometimes in the pages of the Telegraph or wherever, young people are lazy. I think it's true at all. I think what young people have is an economic environment in which they work very hard. They work just as hard as their parents did, but for fewer rewards. Wages have stagnated across the economy. The graduate wage premium has shrunk hugely, so the gap between graduate wages and non-graduate wages is smaller than it was. And the American graduate wage premium, on the other hand, has grown enormously. So why bother spending 3-4 years at university working really hard to earn a kind of a salary that would be an entry-level salary in the US, and which won't be able to get you a house, because of course house prices have also gone up hugely. So a lot of, you know, this whole quiet quitting trend is a symptom of the same ill, which is basically that you work really hard and you get nothing for it. People then look at places like America, and again, this is an internet thing. Most TikToks, so I'm not on TikTok, but my sisters are, and you watch them scroll, and they see these Americans and all that kind of thing, and you know, whatever. But the backdrops to those skits or those kind of informational videos are these enormous kitchens or these huge kind of, you know, 5-bed houses that these 25-year-olds have gone off and gotten in Texas. You know, they do a kind of an okay job, and then they get this gorgeous huge house, which is probably vaguely tasteless, but nevertheless it's a property, and they seem fairly happy, and they can, you know, consume as much as they like, and it's got a girlfriend with a car and a boyfriend with a car and all that kind of thing. And you see that, and that's the kind of passive mood music of your internet consumption nowadays. It's of America being a much richer country. It's of higher standards of living in countries like Australia. I think America still feels a bit other to most Brits. I think Australia feels a lot more familiar. Even if you don't like those two countries, increasingly people are saying, okay, what the hell, I'll go and do 5 years in Dubai, pay 0% income tax. That sounds great to me. Or they're going, okay, I'll take a slower pace of life in Europe. These are all, as flights become cheaper, as people become less rooted, there is this sense, why am I staying in this country where my work is not rewarded or respected, which seems to lack a kind of self-confidence. There isn't any sense of a great social mission. I go back to Singapore. Singapore is a country that in theory lots of people should be leaving because it's a highly talented, highly skilled workforce in a small labour market. And so you'd expect to see far more Singaporeans move abroad, and lots do. But as a proportion of the population, it's smaller than you might imagine. And the reason is that a lot of Singaporeans, are rewarded very well. They go work hard and then they get payback. But also crucially that Singaporeans feel that they're moving in the right direction.
Right.
Or they're moving in our direction. There's a kind of self-confidence that comes with it. I've got parents and grandparents to care for. We as a nation are moving in X direction. There's a kind of mission to this. That's another of the reasons that you may see the emigration trend tick up in the UK is that we have this, I've written a little bit on this before, this looser family structure. You owe fewer obligations to your family than is the norm elsewhere in the world. So people don't, for example, in this country feel that it's an absolute necessity to care for your elderly relatives. We just never really have in quite the same way. It's been traditionally there's been a level of mutual society support for the elderly. People, of course, care about and love their grandparents, so they do put in a bit of effort, but it isn't quite such a high obligation culture as you see in places like the south of Europe or East Asia, which means, again, you've got fewer routes, you've got, it's not as if you're earning an enormous amount of money, people are delaying family formation, people are buying houses later, so there are fewer things to keep you here, more things to take you away.
And part of the social contract we've always lived with here is that you can do better than the previous generation, or you do better than your parents, your grandparents. If young people feel they can't do better than that, they're here and they need to go elsewhere, what effect will this have on Britain?
Well, yeah, it's the classic Burke thing, right? Edmund Burke says society is a contract not just between those who are living, but those who are yet to be born and those who are dead. So it's kind of intergenerational promise that we make, which is that society will either get better or will remain broadly similar. There are kind of two questions there. One is, what will the effect of immigration be? And it's probably just an exacerbation of our existing problems. So, we're a country that should have a higher skill base than it does, but we lose a lot of our high-skilled people to America. If you're a high-skilled tech or coding whiz, you don't stay here. You go to Silicon Valley. I've got friends from university, super bright people, would love to have stayed in the UK and built a company, get into the nascent stages of building a company and just go, well, let's stop this. Yeah. Right? The money's in America, we'll go to America. The effect that has is you lose talented people. The effect of losing talented people is you lose innovation, growth, wealth. You lose the kind of agglomeration effects of having lots of smart people in one place. So, you think about those great moments, those great historical places and moments where there are lots of philosophy happening, lots of science happening, lots of ideas sprouting out. Vienna in the 19th century, London in the 17th century. It comes from having lots of smart people in the same place interacting with each other. So, you'll know this yourself. You go and talk to interesting people, you come away and you go, oh, hang on a minute, that links up to something else I've heard, yeah. and thus ideas are born. And, losing that agglomeration effect of lots of smart people in one place will have a long-term impact on kind of innovation and the number of good companies being started here, the number of ideas being born here, etc. All of these things are kind of, don't spell a great story for the long term of the economy. The broader question about social contract breakdown is an interesting one. I think it basically pushes people towards some kind of radicalism. Because what you do is you say, well, the odd thing about the social contract is the only contract you don't sign. But you can kind of opt out of it. You can kind of go, well, I'm going to tear up the system, and I'm going to make it my life's mission to tear up the system. I'm not saying everybody will do that. Most people will passively go along with it and be frustrated with it and, vote maybe for parties that are a bit more radical when it comes to election time, but they're not really thinking about it very much. But what we do see is that more and more young people are attracted to radical ideological positions of the left and of the right. what those two ideas have in common is basically, I don't like what we've got now, let's have something totally different. And the result of that is a political culture in which it's very, very difficult to kind of build consensus, build coalition, move people forward in the right direction, or in a direction that is kind of agreed upon. And that's what happens when you promise people things that you can't deliver, right? It's no wonder that people get frustrated with the system. It's no wonder whatsoever. And I think in this country in particular, one of the concerning things is that our social contract has been so skewed by age. And, this is kind of the sine qua non of what we do at the Next Generation Centre, is that older people in Britain today are some of the richest, most asset-rich in particular, generations ever. 25% of British pensioners are millionaires if you account for assets, which is a crazy statistic. Whereas people my age are in for a situation where their wealth over their lives is heavily dependent on how rich their parents are, right? Because we've not created a system in which people can go out and build their own wealth. What of course happens is inherited wealth gets passed down. That's a scary thing from a social contract perspective, because what you create there is a reliance upon an older generation. You're basically waiting for your granny to die to be able to buy a house. That's not good for anyone. You end up creating resentment intergenerationally. Old people feel they've been promised a state pension as they get old. They feel they've been promised winter fuel duty, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks. Young people say, well, that wasn't really a pot you paid into. That was taken out of general taxation. We're working really hard now, but we can't necessarily service it. And so old people go, well, it's your fault, laziness, your inability to get on the housing ladder is your own fault. It just frays relationships between generations in a really unhelpful way.
So pushing people towards radicalism, whether it's left or right, is quite a worrying prospect. I mean, what can we do about that?
I think and I would say this, being from the Adam Smith Institute, the best thing you can do to counteract radicalism is to make people fabulously wealthy, right? And that's not about making individual people fabulously wealthy. It's about allowing people to make themselves rich. Societies that are kind of growing and prosperous and hard work is genuinely rewarded, those aren't really societies that suffer a great deal of radicalism. Look at the UK in the 1930s even. We had come out of a really difficult couple of decades, but because of Stanley Baldwin's reforms in the 20s and 30s, we were having a bit of an economic boom. We basically resisted the kind of ideologies that were taking root on the continent: communism, fascism, broad-based kind of authoritarianism. Never really had any intellectual or political purchase here. And that wasn't, I think people love to chalk it up to kind of great British moderation. And I think this is essentially wrong. I think it's more about the fact that Stanley Baldwin built lots of homes, deregulated, heavily regulated bits of the economy, allowed people to make a bit of money, and then you get a kind of comfortable suburban middle class which goes, well, why would I tear this up? This is great. I'm really, really enjoying this. It's about giving people a stake in society. People don't tend to burn things down if they've got a stake in them. They will say, well, I've got my house, I've got my kids, I don't really want to rock the boat, right? And we all see it as we kind of interact with people at different ages. The older you get, typically the more risk averse you are, because you've got more to lose, right? Not always, not in all people, but if you're somebody rooted with a house and kids and a good career, you're absolutely going to look at a radical political position and say, well, why would I roll the dice? This is pretty good for me, actually. People roll the dice when they feel they've got no other choice. And so I would say, long term, it's about the economic stuff. Short term, it's about articulating a centre-right conservative message that is at once kind of moderate, but also offering something new. So, when we talk about this housing stuff, it's a fairly radical position to say we're going to hugely deregulate planning, we're going to make it much easier for people to get on the housing ladder. That's a fairly radical political position in the context of the last 30 years. But it's also moderate in what it's trying to do. It's not about complete system change. It's about making the system work on its own terms, about saying, this is the way we've done things for a very long time. We just want to keep doing it. But we have to recognise that, this is an alternative to what we've got now, which is a system that isn't working because we're not trying to make it work on its own assumptions.
So we recently saw the new budget come out. What messages did you feel that sent to young people?
The headline obviously is all about the tax stuff. So capital gains going up, non-doms loophole closed, etc. Now, per se, that isn't really. Those aren't really the kind of changes that affect many young people. Most young people are not earning enough really to be affected by those changes in a big way. It does send a signal again that we're not a country that necessarily rewards wealth creation very much. That actually, we care more about redistributing income in a flat way than about, trying to make more and more people excel. This is a kind of political choice that you've got to make. It's how many people are you willing to let go off and do really exciting things and get fabulously rich at the potentially at the expense or the perceived expense of those in the median. And obviously, free market think tanks like the Adam Smith Institute will say, well, it's not a zero-sum game. Actually, this end pulls up the median too. But this isn't the Labour Party's philosophy. We knew it wouldn't be the Labour Party's philosophy. Nobody who was serious would kind of be under any apprehensions that this wasn't going to be a tax-raising, higher spending budget. I think the depressing thing about it, though, was not about any particular measure. It was just it was the complete failure to deal with any of the big questions. So we've got this kind of huge monolithic NHS that we spend more and more on each year. Services get worse and worse each year. And rather than talking about reform, replacement, I think is probably not, is beyond the pale politically, certainly for the Labour Party. But talking about serious NHS reform, rather than that, what we had was more money thrown at it. It was 22 billion. No ability to deal with that. No ability to deal with the state pension, which is getting more and more and more expensive every year. No willingness to deal with the debt. And people don't believe me when I say this. We spend 110 billion a year on servicing the debt. So in other words, just on paying the interest, right? 110 billion is it's something like 3 or 4 channel tunnels, right? That is an opportunity cost. It's a huge opportunity cost. That is money that could be spent on public services or on big infrastructure or on doing something kind of bold and exciting, or even just improving small things, electrifying rail lines here and there or whatever. But that is a huge opportunity cost. There was no grappling with debt conceptually, no grappling with the state pension, nothing on the NHS, nothing really on planning and on our ability to build new infrastructure, new energy infrastructure, new houses, etc. All these big questions were left to one side, and it was about shuffling around the money that was finding what we can from here, sending it there. The phrase rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic kind of springs to mind. We didn't deal with any of the hard long-term existential questions. It was a budget that was really about finding a bit more money and kind of shuffling it around here and there.
So to fix the economy would take some quite tough decisions from this government or any government. What are they? What things need to be done in your opinion?
Well, this is the thing, right? If it was easy, that it would have happened. Right? Politicians are not, by and large, evil people. They are self-interested people, as are we all, and certainly for the last 30 years, it's been my view that politicians have tended to make the decisions that have been electorally beneficial rather than kind of nationally beneficial. And it's easy to see why, right? Your job depends on your winning of elections. Not everybody has got the risk appetite of somebody like Margaret Thatcher, who, like her or loathe her, made tough decisions for long-term payoff, or certainly what she perceived and many people perceived to be long-term payoff. To take up a few examples, planning is a really good one. We've got to get out of this position wherein local government can block the construction of a new train line and drive up costs into the billions. It's not just about local government, it's also about the fact that HS2 spent billions on environmental reviews, archaeological reviews, judicial review, etc. All of these lengthy review processes which drive up costs of national infrastructure and make it very difficult to build these big ambitious projects that would get the economy moving again. Energy is another one. Right? We find it very difficult to build energy infrastructure in this country. There is no country in the world where energy is cheap and the economy isn't growing, and the same is true other way. Right? There is no economy in the world where energy is expensive and the economy is growing. We've got the highest industrial energy prices in Europe. So is it any wonder we don't have this great growing industrial sector that people like to kind of wax lyrical about? That's on the planning side. More broadly, clearly there has to be some reckoning with the NHS. We, in my view, long term, should be looking at a kind of European-style social insurance model for some people. That's not to say that anybody would be denied access to healthcare. I think you'd struggle to argue that in a country like the Netherlands or France, people are en masse losing access to healthcare. They're really struggling. They're paying thousands of pounds for an ambulance. That's this kind of America stereotype. It's not the case in Europe. Almost nowhere in Europe has a single-payer universal healthcare system free at the point of use in the way that we do, and yet they seem to be doing broadly okay. I think there has to be, even if we don't do that, we've got to do, we've got to make the NHS more efficient and be honest about the fact that this is not, we can't do cradle to grave. When the NHS was born, actually do a better one, the state pension. When the state pension was introduced, the average person would claim the state pension for 2 years before dying.
Yeah.
Right? It's now about 20. Right? Of course, the system doesn't work. It was established for a different society 80 years ago.
Length of life has gone up by so much.
Totally, and also like the complexity of people's healthcare. The services that the NHS were providing in 1950, if we strip them back to that, there would be riots in the streets. People would go crazy. We've added and added and added more and more and more, and each individual decision has been justifiable. Let's put this on the NHS, let's put that on the NHS, we need to care for these sorts of people, etc. Every single individual decision has been defensible. You've been able to say, okay, I can see the case for that. In the aggregate, across an 80-year period, what you have is a totally unwieldy service. It doesn't work. Nobody sat down and thought about how it all fits together, and nobody's been willing to say, because of the short-term political kind of pain, well, maybe the NHS shouldn't actually do that. Maybe we should procure in a different way. Maybe we should not provide that service. Maybe we should be more comfortable with working with private providers on non-essential surgeries, etc. Nobody's done that. State pension, another area, nobody's done it. Again, we can't have a system where, when we had Rachel Reeves bragging yesterday, pensions will go up faster than inflation. We can't continue with that as a system year on year. If you want an example as to why, CPS did a bit of work and calculated that we would need to grow 2.8%, economy would need to grow 2.8% for the next 50 years to meet our current welfare budget.
Right.
Now, we're growing at 1.1, 1.2. The high end is 1.5, 1.6. We're way below. We need to be growing about double what we are now just to keep our heads above water. That, to me, speaks to long-term obligations that we really can't keep. We can't keep shelling out tens of billions extra a year on pensions and healthcare and social care. Social care, another one, really big, difficult subject. I'm not going to claim to have all the answers. It would just be, a start would be politicians who are willing to look at these things rather than looking at them as sacred cows, be willing to say, actually, we will review this, we will accept that this needs to change. We are open to many different ways of doing this, but we recognise that there has to be something that isn't what we've got now.
At the Next Generation Centre, you're working with young people on policy, economic policy, government policy. How optimistic are you that the next generation can come through and help us solve some of these problems?
I'm enormously optimistic, and that's actually true. I used to go back and forth on it a bit more. I'm much more kind of excited about it now. When I started in politics around the time of the referendum, this stuff was nowhere. Right, the housing stuff was nowhere. Questions about the state pension were absolutely nowhere. The idea that a Tory politician could ever criticise the NHS in public was, that's a career ender as far as most people are concerned. We've actually come a long way. Now, am I optimistic about the UK's economy in the next 10 years? No. I think things will probably have to get a bit worse before they get better. We're going to need a real programme of reform and of serious consideration about the economic model, about the promises that we make each generation, about, taking on some of these vested interests in areas like planning. But long term, I'm super optimistic. I just think it's so obvious that this can't go on. And I think most young people that I talk to, it's remarkable. I've done this year, I did Tory conference, Labour conference and Reform conference with the ASI. And I spoke to young people at all three, and there were some kind of aesthetic differences. There were some differences in how each group responds to different kinds of rhetoric. Farage wouldn't play very well at Labour conference, I imagine. But what was really interesting is most of them were agreed on most of the core issues, right? Even on things like immigration. By and large, most young people that I spoke to and this is borne out in the polling, think that immigration should be lower. They don't necessarily want to have those conversations in kind of raised temperature, aggressive terms. They want it to be quite a moderate and boring conversation. But ultimately the position they settle on is, yes, actually migration has been too high. Same with planning. Most people have basically accepted that the planning system is broken. Most people have basically accepted that the NHS is not going to, we as people who are in our 20s and 30s are not going to be able to access the NHS in the same way that our parents did, and that's probably fine. There's actually a great deal of consensus amongst people below a certain age because it's so obvious that what we've got now is not working.
Sam Bidwell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.